The hum of overhead fluorescent lights filled the open-plan floor of Viridian Creative Group, mixing with the rapid clack of mechanical keyboards and distant chatter between co-workers. Lila Hale stared down at her laptop screen, her thumb hovering over the trackpad, every muscle in her body tight with a cold, vivid memory that did not belong to this present moment. 3 days. In her past life, exactly 3 days from this afternoon, she would send over every raw draft, every brainstorm note, every annotated sketch of the flagship brand redesign project she had poured 7 months of late nights into. She would hand all of it to Mara Carter, her closest work friend, the woman she had trusted with every professional fear and every half-formed creative thought. Back then, Mara had smiled softly and said it was only for quick proofreading before the leadership review. Lila had believed her blindly. By the end of that quarter, Mara stood in the company all-hands meeting, taking full credit for Lila's entire body of work, accepting a huge promotion to senior creative lead, a hefty annual bonus, and a coveted downtown corporate apartment. Worse, Mara had slowly twisted Lila's long-term boyfriend Ethan again, feeding him edited snippets of their private conversation, painting Lila as bitter, overly emotionally At the company holiday, Mara seduced Ethan while Lila stayed late at the office fixing last-minute project. When Lila finally confronted it, their manager Clara Bennett bought every tear-stained lie Lila was pushed. Her reputation. She sank into deep, watched Mara live the glamorous life that should have been, until regret ate away at every. And then she was right. Autumn sunlight slanting through the tall office. The half-finished redesign project open on the calendar on her desktop showing the exact week before every disaster. A sharp knock landed on the edge, pulling Lila out of her swirling Mara leaned against him, her dark hair perfect styled, soft, sympathetic smile tugging, the exact practiced expression Lila remembered. Her voice warm, sweet, just like it had been in the Hey, you've been buried in that big client project. How long? Mara asked, tilting me. Clara is breathing down our necks for preliminaries. Would you mind shooting me over your draft files late afternoon? I can catch any small mistakes before you submit. It'll save you so much stress before Lila tightened. The script was playing out exactly as it had in her. Every word, every gesture, every quiet underlying demand identical. In her reality, have nodded, grateful for help, relieved to have someone she thought. But this time, every hidden layer behind Mara's gentle request was clear to her. This was the theft. If she handed over now, Mara would strip Lila's name document, polish slightly, and present everything as her own. Lila dragged her gaze away from Mara's bright. She glanced across the office toward Clara's walled office, where their manager typed her computer, already predisposed to somewhere in cubicles, Ethan sat focused on tasks, completely oblivious to the manipulation waiting to unravel their relation. Old to bubble up, rage, grief, the heavy weight of years of wasted effort against her ribs, but loves to cry, used to argue, refused to waste breath trying to warn people who believe her anyway. Arguing would only play Mara's hands, giving her ammunition to label Lila. She had thought through this moment hundreds of times since waking. She was not credit here. She was going. Lila sat in her office chair, closed her project lock. I'm not going to send you any files. Mara smiled for half a second, surprise flickering across her face before she smoothed her feet. Wait, what? Is everything okay? Did I say something wrong? Everything is fine, Lila answered. Her desk drawer, pulled out her printable resignation neatly. She stood, slung her thin can on one shoulder. Neighbor glanced over. Movement. I'm active immediately. Mara blankly caught off guard. Resigning? Lila, you can't be serious. That project is due in days. Where is this coming from? Voices by cubicles faded, several co-workers pausing their work to stare over at the scene office. Lila did not elaborate. No long explanation. List of accusations. No tearful recounting of the other life. There was no point. No one would believe stories of life. She set her resignation letter on the edge of Clara's empty desk outside the glass attached. She did not look the growing look of panic. She walked past the workstation without stopping, ignoring he sent her way. Her shoes tapped softly against the tile hall headed for the building exit. Lobby doors slid open. Crisp autumn wind hitting she stepped out. Behind her, inside Viridian Creative Group, the stable world Mara had planned to build from Lila's stolen was already starting to crack. Mara stood beside Lila, heart hammering. All her laid plans for the promotion, for acing the client, for securing her future, depended entirely on project material. Without nothing substantial to present, panic coiled tight in her stomach as she vanished through the lobby doors. How Lila just quit out of nowhere, without a single warning. The second-floor open-plan office at Viridian Creative Group hummed with uneasy tension the morning after Lila Hale walked out without a backward glance. Word of her abrupt, unannounced resignation had spread fast through cubicle rows. Co-workers traded quiet side-eye glances, whispering over coffee mugs and Slack messages, nobody quite understanding why one of their sharpest creative minds would abandon a high-profile flagship project only days before the critical client pitch. Mara Carter sat at her desk, fingers hovering uselessly over her keyboard, a cold knot of anxiety settling deep in her chest. She had spent the rest of yesterday afternoon scrolling through old shared drives, digging through every shared folder they had ever used together, hoping to stumble across some unfinished fragment of Lila's brand redesign work. What little she found was rough, half-jotted brainstorm bullet points, nothing polished enough to stand up in front of senior leadership in the big retail client. No complete layout, no refined color palette, none of the clever consumer-focused storytelling that made Lila's concepts stand apart. Every important file had lived on Lila's personal encrypted laptop, and Lila had taken it all with her when she left. A notification popped up on her screen. Clara Bennett, their manager, sent an instant message asking for a status check on the upcoming pitch material. Mara's throat went. She had built her entire reputation on writing other people's text, and right now she had almost nothing tangible to. She typed and deleted 3 different replies, forcing herself to breathe slow to calm her rising. She could not admit. If Clara learned she had counted entirely on work that belonged to someone who was now, her shot at the senior creative lead would evaporate. She pushed out of her and walked toward Clara's glass, putting on her most weary, earnest expression. When she stepped aside, Clara glanced up from. I heard about Lila. The client is expecting our full presentation. Clara folded her arms across her. Did Lila leave behind completed drafts for them? I was counting on you two delivering. Mara put on a soft, troubled, tilting her head like she was equal. I'm just as shocked. Lila never mentioned me. I've gone through all our shells. Most of her finalized work was stored locally. She didn't check much into the system before paused, letting a hint of hurt bleed tone. I get, but her exit feels really. It's almost like she bailed intentionally to. Clara's brow together. That does sound out of. No, nodded, pressing her doubt. Or maybe she was frustrated about something I know about. Regardless, I will do everything I can to push together. It will just mean 8 nights. I'll have to rebuild large satch. It was a lie. Mara had no idea how to recreate Lila's layered concepts, but framing herself as the hard-done-by hero stepping up to Lila's mess kept suspicion far away from own schemes. Clara bought the completely, her expression soft. I appreciate you stepping up under these terrible chances, Clara said. Do it at port. Just make sure that patient lands. That client means millions in annual. Stepping back out of Roger's office, Mara's relief lasted barely 10 seconds before dread. She back, or at minimum. She pulled out her phone and tapped. Her face was warm, concerned, pretending genuine worry for old friend. Heard you resigned out of nowhere. Are you okay? Well, we can talk. The whole team is stuck with files. No reply. Waited 20 minutes, then sent another, tripping. You know this pit our department. People are on the line here. Could you at least send over the draft already finished? You don't even come back to the office, still nothing. Lila read the messages. Not even a blue read receipt. Mara's temper flicked mask. She had counted on Lila being the forgiving, cooperative line. This cold radio silence. Down the aisle, Ethan noticed restlessness. Wandered over to her cubicle. Confusion. Lila quit yesterday. Did you see that? Ethan asked. I tried texting her too. Wasn't answering me either. Mara's jaw tightened. Ethan was steadily invested in Lila. Hated everything. In her past winning timeline, she had slowly turned Lila over months, while that path was slipping away. She adjusted her soft and sorrow. I had no clue. We were talking about the project. The next she handed out. She and touched his arm. I hope she's all right. I just would like this. And nodded slowly, in his eyes. Something in the situation felt off. His finger on watch. Meanwhile, away from the office towers, Lila sat in a sun-dappled neighborhood sipping an oat milk latte. She had muted work-related phone notifications, saw every text Mara sent, and pile up one after another. She also saw Ethan's worried messages pop up, but she left all of them unanswered. She was not going to take the bait. She would not step back into that toxic, crumbling career. Back at Viridian Creative Group, rolled into evening. Co-workers headed home for the day, but Mara stayed glued to her desk, patience slide. She dragged stock images onto the canvas, trying desperately to mimic creative voice. Every felt flat, hollow, generic. She deleted slide after slide. Panic bubbled higher inside her. Deadlines were. She was running out of time. A new thought blew, sharp and desperate. Texts were not. Emails were going. If digital pleas failed, she would find another way to reach Lila directly. Pulled up Lila's old employee profile. It still listed her apartment building address or paperwork. Mara grabbed her purse. The office emptied around her. She knew exactly where she needed to go. Dusk painted the city sky soft shades of violet and burnt orange as Mara pulled her sedan into the visitor parking lot of Lila's apartment complex. Streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long, thin shadows across the concrete walkways. She had replayed every possible conversation in her head during the short drive, cycling through different versions of pleas, gentle persuasion, and quiet veiled threat. One moment she planned to cry and beg for mercy. The next she imagined lashing out in anger. By the time she climbed out of the car, her hands were clammy against the strap of her leather purse. She located Lila's building number from the HR address record and walked up the concrete stairwell. The hallway smelled like faint citrus-scented cleaning spray. When she stood before Lila's front door, she hesitated for only a second, then knocked firmly. 3 sharp raps against the wood. Inside the apartment, Lila had been curled up on her couch, flipping through sketch paper, free from the crushing pressure of corporate deadlines for the first time in months. The knock startled. She set her notebook down and padded quietly over to the peephole. Her body went rigid the instant she spotted Mara's familiar figure standing out in the hall. She had half expected this might happen. Seeing Mara show up unannounced at her private residence sent a cold spike of alarm through her chest. Lila stepped back from the door, making certain she stayed out of. She did not. Mara knocked in, louder than. Lila, I know you're. I saw your car parked downstairs. Please, just over. We need. Her voice carried through the tight with fraying silencing. Mara's carefully practiced gentle act started. She lowered her voice, but frustration seeped through every. Don't. This isn't just me. The whole team is counting on that project. You can't just bury all that work and walk away like none of it. Leaning her forehead lightly against the cool doors, she shifted back into a tear-stained prince. I never knew. Whatever I did to upset you, sorry. Can't we this? Just send over the redenials, and you never even have to step foot in the. Behind the door, Lila listened without a flick. She remembered every time Mara had pulled this exact tearful routine in her life, twisting apologies into motivation. Giving in now would restart the whole cycle again. She pulled out her phone and tapped a quick text to the building manager, reporting an uninvited visitor harassed. She kept dim, stayed well away, and refused to give Mara so much as away. Mara's temper finally snapped when it became obvious Lila would never. Her voice sharpened, no longer subtle. You're childish. You think you can ruin my future because you're angry? I'll follow you. Word will get the industry. No creative firm will want to hire someone who abandons critical clients. The threat hung heavy. Before she could pound the door once more, distant footsteps. 2 building security off the corner. They had received the Ma'am, you need to leave immediately, one of the security said firmly. The resident has stated him here. Mara's face flushed. Caught red-handed harassing private apartment, she could argue her case. She shot one last furious glare toward Lila's closed front door, clenched tight, before turning on her heel and stormed stairs, back in her car. Mara slammed the driver's door shut so it was rattled, cheeks burned. This like she planned. Coming only embarrassed her, and left with 0 files, 0 cooperation. She opened her phone and fired off a bitter, accusatory Clara. She put Lila as unreasonable, and claimed Lila had refused even to hear the help. She omitted entirely that she had driven over to Lila's apartment. Mara burned with rage. Lila sank back onto her couch once the sound of Mara's car reached her, shaking slightly. Having Mara invade her private space had rattled her admit. She pulled up job postings for independent creators on her tablet. She would not waste the old fight. She knew for herself. Separate. She understood now. Mara would not. Morning at the office. Clara called Mara into her glass office email. The client had sent her an urgent reminder email, demanding to rough slides by end day. Mara sat from her manager's desk, pretending to be swinging the pitch. Internally, she spiraled. Every hour that ticked by brought her exposure. He peered past the office door and conversation. He heard Mara describe Lila as emotional and uncooperative. Something about the story to Lila he knew. That evening, he drove across town to Lex on his own. He did not have mild sense of urgency at answers. He texted first. I would be willing to meet, no pressure. Lila stared at the on her screen. Seeing it brought up old hurt from her past life. Missed the man he used to be. Yet she knew how easy his perception. Replying meant opening her back toward that toxic world. Ignoring him straight back into Mara's orbit. It was cost choice either way. Thumb hovered over the reply box. For the first time since her rebirth, Lila was not completely sure what move she ought to make next. Lila sat with Ethan at a sun-faded corner booth inside a small neighborhood diner, the clink of coffee mugs and distant low chatter wrapping around their table. She had weighed her options late into the previous night. Ignoring Ethan entirely might push him to accept Mara's skewed version of reality forever. Agreeing to meet felt risky, but at least she could hear what he had to say without stepping back into Viridian's toxic office walls. She had arrived 10 minutes early, picked a public, well-lit spot, and kept her bag resting heavy across her lap, ready to leave at any moment. Ethan slid into the seat across from her, his brow lined with quiet confusion. He stirred cream into his black coffee, his gaze searching her face. "I still can't wrap my head around you walking out like that," he said gently. "No warning, no exit interview. Everyone back at the office says you bailed and left the whole flagship project hanging. Mara told Clara you refused to send over your drafts even when the team bet." Lila's fingers curled loosely around her ceramic mug. She could not tell him about Rebirth, about the stolen future she carried from another life. That story would sound like mad. Without that critical context, proving Mara's long pattern of manipulation was far harder than it seemed. If she unleashed every accusation right, she would sound bitter and vengeful. Exactly the label Mara had spent planting in everyone's mind. "I didn't owe that company my unfinished creative work after I resigned," Lila replied. "I'd poured months of personal overtime into that project. None of that belonged to me, but I had no obligation to hand it over the second I walked out." Ethan tilted. "But hundreds of work. It would have saved so much stress for the whole department. Mara's been pulling all nights trying to rebuild everything from..." Lila bit back a sharp hurt. Of course Mara told him she was rebuilding everything from scratch. It was He still accepted Mara's self-framed hero, and Lila saw how deep the misinformation. Their conversation circles. Ethan wanted explanations Lila could safely give. He kept returning to the damage her sudden resignation had inflicted, barely pausing to ask what had pushed Lila to quit in the... By the time their coffee cooled, Lila realized her. She had hoped Ethan's faint suspicion would bloom into clear-sighted ending. Instead, he was anchored to the office's shared version. Lila diner, a heavy loneliness for her. Even the person she had once loved could not see through Mara's carefully constructed. Back at Viridian, the pressure was... The client preliminary review was less than 48. Every rough slide she assembled felt hollow. She could not match Lila's sharp insights, and she grew increasingly paranoid someone would notice how shallow her material. She poured energy into office politics instead of actuation. She dropped by Clara's desk multiple days, updating her booths, describing late-night work sessions that rarely produced. Word drifted through the office grapevine that Ethan had met. Mara saw Ethan return from a distant, pre-ed look, and a cold twist of jealousy and fear not. If Ethan started Lila, one of her most valuable social... She cornered Ethan by the copy work. Her voice hurt with Lila, she said, keeping her tone low so nearby co-worker not overhear. "I get it. This whole thing messy for you. I just worry she's trying to against everyone, and angry, and I'm afraid she'll twist things to make her..." Ethan frowned. She didn't say anything. She just wouldn't give a fitting. Eyes glistened. "That's the problem. She won't face what she did. All those people count that client deal. I lie awake at night terrified to lose this contract, and it all turned out." She reached out and forearm lightly, the same practiced gesture she had used many times before. "I hate you into this drama. I just don't want to see you get..." Faint doubts faded, smothered beneath Mara's quiet performance. Nodded slowly, convinced. Meanwhile, Lila received an unexpected email from a former co-worker, a junior designer who had worked prior. The short message late in the evening. The junior wrote that Mara had quietly asked her to copy fragments from old marketing campaigns to pass presentation slides, trying to disguise the lips. The junior felt uneasy about being asked to do, and slipped anonymously, too afraid to management. Reading the message, Lila understood Mara was growing desperate enough to recycle old, repurposed content just to fill slides. Yet this tip was only hearsay. Without concrete documents or direct link to testify, it would carry almost no weight against polished reputation and Clara's bias. Lila stared out her apartment with city streets. She had thought stepping away would simply let Mara's lips under their own weight. Messier. Lies could prop themselves up with stolen scraps and ants. At the office, Mara called her complete draft client preview. It was packed with recycled content, official visuals, none of core original thinking. Sent a copy over to Clara, putting on a triumph in her accompanying message. writing about how proud she was to pull everything together in conditions. Privately, her hands shook. She knew what presentation was. She crossed her fingers and prayed dig too deep. Clara was full of praise. She told Mara she was proving exactly why she deserved promotion. When Mara read that line, relief flooded over her, panic gnawed underneath. One client question about Jack's core creative logic, one sharp follow-up, and the entire patched-together fraud could stakeholder. Downstairs, bag for the night. He texted once more, short and final. He understood she was hurting, but he cared what had happened. He was chewing at work. Lila read the message and on the coffee table. Her small hope of then over to her side was desolated. Town in Viridian's office building, sat alone in the dim conference room, her presentation. She had bought herself temporary praise, not solved the root problem. The client meeting loomed tomorrow morning, and just beneath every slide. Bright ceiling lights flooded Viridian Creative Group's main conference room. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls looked out over the busy downtown skyline. The big client's leadership team filed in one by one, carrying leather notebooks and tablet computers, ready for the high-stake brand redesign preview. Clara greeted them with a warm handshake, her expression confident. Mara sat at the presenter's table, her pulse hammering hard behind her composed smile. Every slide on her deck was built from repurposed old marketing assets, stripped-down generic ideas, and faint scraps of Lila's early brainstorm notes. There was no original core strategy underneath it all. She began her presentation, voice steady and polished. For the first 10 minutes, everything went smoothly. The clients nodded along, commenting positively on the visual aesthetic. Mara's shoulders relaxed slightly. Maybe she would get away with it. Maybe shallow visuals would be enough to impress. Then the senior client marketing director leaned forward in her chair, tapping a finger against the table surface. I like the look of these layouts, but walk us through the consumer behavior reasoning behind the core brand. We saw early rough notes mentioning a unique youth audience. Where is that built into your strategy? Mara's blood ran cold. That sharp, game-changing consumer belonged entirely to Mara had skimmed Lila's bullet points months, but she had never fully understood the never dug into the supporting. She had cut that section out of her patched-up slides because she could not explain. Her mind raced, grasping for something coherent. She stumbled through a vague, rambling, mixing generic market statistics that did not tie back to their specific brand. Frowns spread across several of the client members. Their questions, one sharp follow-up after. They pressed for data's, for risk assessments, for the long-term growth roadmap Lila had spent weeks. Mara could not deliver substantive. She acted, changed, tried to steer the conversation back toward pretty. The atmosphere in the room shifted from polite interest to quiet. By the time the meeting, the client was far from. They did not reject the project, but they delivered firm. The concept, and they needed a fully revised strategic deck delivered within 3. Or they would pause their multi-million-dollar partnership with. Once the clients had left the conference room, Clara shut the head door, her usual easygoing on, frustration plain across. What's in there? Clara, you told me this strategy. You said you rebuilt the whole strategy scratch. Today you could barely answer basic strategies. Mara's dry, neck flared, and she fell back on her familiar playpen. Thrown off. I didn't get enough sleep all nights. Some of the deeper strategic layers slipped my mind. That bull. Clara her arms. This client generates huge revenue for us. 3 days. That is all the time with every gap. If the next version fails, count. And there will be real professional consequences for everyone. Mara left the conference room with her reputation badly dented, even if she had not been exposed yet. Word of the rocky client meeting spread fast through Slack channels, co-workers themselves. People started noticing the big gap between Mara's glossy presentation slides and her inability to defend. That evening, Lila sat at her kitchen counter scrolling through freelance creative job lists. It was the anonymous junior designer from Viridian, sent a secret message. The junior had sat in the back of client preview meeting and watched Mara stumble through question. More importantly, she had dug up old internal chat logs saved on company drive. The chat threads proved Mara had repeatedly begged Lila for strategy brainstorming material we find. Those messages were time-stamped proof that Mara had relied on Lila's creative input long before. The junior designer was still terrified of return management, so she dared forward publicly. But she sent screenshots of logs over to Lila, saying she could not keep watching Mara take credit. Through the screenshots, it tightened. It was tangible evidence, anonymous day. Still, Haitian weighed on her. If she sent these screenshots to Clara right now, the juniors identically get traced back. Blowing everything up publicly would destroy that young designer inside the industry. Lila could not in good conscience sacrifice another pound. While her limited options, Mara spiraled deeper into determination. The 3-day deadline hung a guillotine blade. She could not build the missing foundation herself. Her last realistic hope still circled, forcing Lila to help her. She opened up her blocked contact list, phone number. She composed a text, warm or pleading. This one carried clear threats. Strategy that I need. If you refuse to help fix this project, I will tell every creative hiring manager in town that you abandoned critical work mid-contract. Your freelance career. Lila's message. She stared at the screen, the cold blackmail. Mara was no longer begging. She was trying to destroy Lila's new freelancer compliance. Lila sat silent. Before this, she had only wanted to walk away, build her own peaceful new life. But Mara wasn't to let her vanish quietly. The villain was actively reaching across her fresh. The safe, passive escape Lila no longer an option. Passive withdrawal lies collapse. She would have to fight back, but every path forward keep unavoidable costs. The weight of Mara's threat hung heavy over Lila through the long, sleepless night. She laid awake on her couch, the screenshots of old chat logs open on her tablet, turning every possible angle over in her mind. If she leaked the records to Clara, the anonymous junior designer would almost certainly be tracked down. Internal IT could trace file access timestamps, and Viridian's management would hunt for the whistleblower. That young woman would get blacklisted in the tight-knit local creative industry, punished for doing the right thing. Lila could not bring herself to ruin another person's career just to settle her own score. At the same time, giving in to blackmail was unthinkable. Handing over her strategy notes would mean repeating the cycle of her past life. Mara would patch the gaps in the presentation, save her promotion, and walk away scot-free while Lila got nothing. Even staying silent came with a steep price. Mara was already promising to smear her reputation across every local creative agency, poisoning freelance opportunities before they could take root. There was no clean, pain-free path forward. The next morning, Ethan sent Lila one last cautious message. He had heard office chatter about the disastrous client meeting, and confusion gnawed at him again. He asked whether Lila would be willing to explain what was really going on. Lila stared at the text for minutes. Even if she opened up to Ethan, she still could not explain where her insight originated. The rebirth remained locked inside, impossible to prove. Without that core context, her story would sound fragmented and self-serving. She weighed the risk of drawing him back into the then chose not to. She could no longer afford to invest hope in an ally who could so easily be swayed by Mara's manipulative performance. Their quiet chapter was closed. Back inside Viridian Creative, panic rippled through the 3-day revision deadline loomed. Clara kept pressing Mara for concrete progress, growing more skeptical with each pass. Mara spent most of her workday jumping between half-finished slides, fruitless brainstorming, and desperate attempts to beg other coworkers to fill in the strategic gaps she could not create. Every teammate she approached turned word of the client meeting, and no one wanted to attach their name to a sinking. Mara's stress frayed her usual polished. Her once impeccable office charm struck. Short-tempered outbursts slipped out toward junior staff behind closed. The anonymous designer who had sent Lila evidence bore the brunt of one of those sharp. Sitting at her desk later noon, the young woman messaged again. Mara had snapped at her for small forms, and she feared retaliation was. She told Lila she was ready to step forward, even if it. Lila. She did not want the junior to sacrifice, yet the situation was spinning. If the designer came phone, she would face all the alone. Lila felt trapped between protecting this vulnerable ally and stopping Mara's camp. That evening, Mara grew more. She sent 2 more hostile texts. She repeated her threat to ruin Lila's freelance and added, hand over all the original strategic files within hours, or she would file a formal complaint claiming Lila stole proprietary company intellectual property. Resigned. That false complaint could trigger headaches, damage Lila's own checks, and block her from landing nearly any. Lila read those words sitting on her apartment escape. Cold autumn wind. Every escape route she had once imagined sealed off. She had walked away, hoping to simply build a quiet self. But Mara kept dragging into the fight. Friends she might on were few, and was out of reach. The junior was at risk. No manager at Viridian was inclined to believe her without ironclad proof. For the first since her rebirth, Lila sank her advantages. Her memory past betrayal felt useless against real-world. Down in offices, Clara stayed late reviewing what little revised material Mara managed to produce. The slides still lacked the core strategic back client demanded. Pieces of old recycled marketing stuck out like flaws. Clara's long-standing fondness for Mara eroding fast. She had wanted so badly to believe Mara was a rising star, but the evidence of her limitations hour. She called Mara into her office. Staff had gone home, closed behind them. "This is not enough," Clara said flatly, sliding the printout of the revoke across her desk. "You told me you rebuilt entirely. Nothing here fixes called out." "The truth, Mara. What exactly happened when Lila resigned?" Mara's pulse spiked, clung to her old script, still trying to paint an unstable party, shook. She could feel her mouth slipping away, and she knew she could not keep lying longer. Later that night, Lila sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through every text saved. Her outer sources of support almost entirely vanished. Air settled over her, hardened deep inside her. She was knowing just to avoid pain. She was fighting Mara from hurting more people, crafting a careful plan. She would not recklessly blast all the evidence out in an explosive public move. She needed a way to reveal the truth without throwing her under the bus. She out small, deliberate, weighing every risk. Did not know if it would work, but she knew she would no longer ask her to find her. Lila spent the better part of the night refining her careful, multi-step plan spread across separate notes on her tablet. Her highest priority remained shielding the anonymous junior designer from professional ruin. Blasting screenshots straight to Clara would trace back too easily. Instead, she would work around Viridian's internal systems. She would compile redacted versions of the chat log screenshot, cropping out metadata that revealed file access timestamps and user ID markers that could identify the young staffer. She would not send them directly to management. Instead, she would forward the sanitized evidence to Viridian's neutral third-party human resources ethics hotline, an anonymous reporting channel set up for exactly this kind of workplace misconduct. The ethics hotline promised submitter confidentiality. It would not eliminate all risk for the junior designer, but it drastically reduced the chance the whistleblower would be hunted down by internal IT. Lila also drafted a calm, factual written statement. She avoided emotional accusations, kept references to her past resignation brief, and laid out the timeline. Mara's repeated requests for creative, the hollow patched-together client presentation, and the recent blackmail texts Mara had sent, threatening to smear her freelance reputation and file false intellectual property theft claims. She saved copies of every threatening SMS as additional exhibit. Before hitting, Lila hesitated. Even anonymous reports could trigger internal investigation. There was no guarantee HR would act or take her claims seriously. Mara still held plenty of goodwill from months of polished office performance. If the investigation dragged on past the 3-day revision deadline, Mara might still scramble to salvage the project and walk away unscathed. Meanwhile, at Mara's world shrank to panic-fueled chaos. The deadline ticked down to 24 hours. Clara kept pressing her for meaningful progress, and every coworker turned her away when she begged for creep. She had burned through every reusing old marketing assets would no longer patch the massive strategic holes the client had. Growing it, she pulled up Lila's old project Clara, hoping she might have overlooked some buried fragment of usable strategy. Every important file remained locked behind Lila's personal engine, completely ill. Mara's temper. She opened the phone and typed out yet another threatening message, repeating her threat to file that false IP theft. Halfway typing, a calendar alert popped up on her screen reminding her of the fast approach. Her head. For time, she even she could not force Lila to surrender work she would never. Her usual manipulation tactics were failing. Down the hallway, the junior designer noticed Mara's fear coiled test. She worried Mara would lash out and fire her for no real reason before the truth. She sent Lila a quick update, saying she was preparing to collect her personal files from her evening, ready to walk out if retaliation. Lila the message, breath, and tapped submit on her anonymous HR report. Lila had no confirmation HR had even opened mission. She could do. Next morning, Viridian's HR ethics team reached out to Clara with a sealed anonymous. They would not. They only shared redacted chat evidence and described the forms, patterns of creation, version, and threats levied against. HR instructed Clara to pause the project review process temporarily while they opened an internal fact-finding. Clara sat behind her desk, staring at the printed copies of the chat logs. The documents laid bare Mara's repeated pleas for Lila's creative materials long before. All of Mara's earlier stories about rebuilding everything from scratch crumbled before her eyes. A cold sense of disappointment. She had wanted so badly to believe Mara was a high potential. She realized she had let Mara's charm cloud months. Clara called me to her office, closed the door, and laid the printed chat screenshots up. No yelling, dramatic outburst. Her voice quiet and rigid. Can you explain these messages? Mara's face drained of color the second her eyes fell on the chat excerpts. Her mind raced, and new lies, but every use died in her throat. The times lined up perfectly. The word undeniably hers. She had noticed the context. For the first time in the line of deception, Mara lost her smooth control. Her carefully constructed shattered completely. Panic boiled over, and she began stammering disjointed partial excuses, blaming stress, blaming office pressure, claiming she had only borrowed. None of it helped. Clara cut her off. You told me you rebuilt the entire independently. That was not true. You have wasted critical client time and company resources on a present built on other people's work. HR is launching a formal investigation. For now. Mara sat in her chair, stunned. She had spent so long she held all the power in Lila's career. Now the ground out from underneath her bonus, the downtown apartment, everything away. Word of the confidential investigation didn't office yet. Only Clara, HR, and Mara knew what was those doors. But Mara could feel a wall closing in around her. She left the manager's office and her mind racing. She still had a last desperate card to play. If she could track Lila down and negotiate a kind of private settlement, maybe she could still stop the investigation early. Someway in her small apartment, Lila got from Viridian. But she guessed from the shift in dynamic court had landed. She sat by her window, watching the street below. She had flipped the momentum, yet she was far from finished. Mara would not surrender but one final desperate push. Mara left Clara's office with her hands stuffed deep inside her blazer pockets, her vision blurred by hot, frustrated tears she fought hard to hold back. The confidential HR investigation hung over her head like a heavy weight. She understood perfectly what a formal finding of creative appropriation would mean for her career. Local creative industries were tight-knit. Word traveled fast between agencies. She could lose her job, get blacklisted from future senior roles, and watch every reward she had chased for years vanish completely. The office investigation was sealed off from regular staff. Co-workers still went about their ordinary routine, unaware of the storm unfolding behind closed glass walls. The junior designer kept her head down at her workstation, continuing her daily tasks, but she kept copies of all her personal work files backed up to an external drive, ready for sudden retaliation. She sent Lila brief, quiet updates every few hours, confirming she had not been targeted so far. Mara avoided her desk for most of the afternoon, wandering the building's quiet stairwell, turning every possible escape plan over in her head. The official investigation was moving forward, and she could not bribe or manipulate HR. Clara was no longer fooled by her tearful performance. Her only remaining shot lay outside company channel, reaching Lila directly for a private settlement. If Lila agreed to withdraw the anonymous complaint, Mara might still salvage something of her reputation. She knew better than to show up unannounced at Lila's apartment. That stunt had landed her with security intervention before. Instead, she created a new unlisted burner text, untethered from her work phone and employee profile. She sent a message to Lila's personal number late in the afternoon, her tone stripped of earlier. Now it was called an offer for a private off-the-record meeting at a quiet downtown cafe, far away from both their homes and the Viridian office. She promised she would come. No arts, no intimidation. Lila's phone buzzed while she worked on small freelance branding sketches at her kitchen. She read the burner number message. She guessed immediately this. Part of her wanted to ignore the invitation and let the HR process run its natural. But she also recognized this was Mara's final bid. If she refused, Mara might grow reckless and possibly trying to hunt down and retaliate against the anonymous junior designer out of pure. Reluctantly, Lila typed back she agreed, but set strict goals. Publication, 1 hour, and she would leave the second any threats or manipulation. Twilight spilled across the downtown cafe's large front doors. Soft jazz hummed from speakers, and the clink of ceramic mugs in the air. Lila arrived early and picked a table near Ern's, positioning herself where other customers were within. She kept her phone unlocked on top, ready to record audio if the conversation turned. Mara arrived shortly. She had removed her blazer, dressed in plain civilian clothes. Her usual polished comment. Dark circles sat under her eyes, her hunched. She slid into the chair Lila, and for a long stretch they simply sat in silence, while a barista set 2 glasses of ice. I know you filed that anonymous report, Mara began, voice low. I can't prove it, but I said nothing. Just off, Mara pleaded, dropping the aggressively. I will walk away from this emotion. I will give up the bonus and the apartment. I will even write you a private financial settlement on savings. Enough money to cover 3 full months of living expenses while you build your business. Just make the invest appear. This was Mara's last card, the fine sprit bar. Money, surrender of her own prizes, all traded for Lila evidence. Work like that. I don't control HR investigation. Even if I got it down, I cannot retract an board. Jaw tightened, folded up again. This is all about revenge for what happened in our past, isn't it? You are destroying my career because of something that hasn't even time. The words hung sharp dim cafe light. Mara had never loud before, but in her panic let the thought slip. She had suspected for weeks that Lila carried foreknowledge, that Lila had seen the whole stolen war. She had no proof, but the pattern of Lila thickened. Face neutral, refusing to validate or deny observation. The threats you sent, the false ident you planned to file, the way you tried freelance career, and how you would keep hurting other people if you a. Mara's attempt at completely. She leaned forward across the table, voice hiss. If my career burned, drag everyone down with me. I know who sent those shots to HR. I have my guesses about which employee gave you the material. Do not push me into a corner left to lose. The threat hung heavy, quiet space between them. She was openly threatening to target anonymous junior designer, Lila's worst fear. Mara was willing to hurt an innocent save herself. At that exact moment, the cafe. He had picked this casual takeout dinner, completely unaware would be there. He spotted their table movement and froze in the doorway. He caught the sharp, angry Mara's last sentence. Hard look on Lila's face. All the neatly packed office narrative he had accepted for so long, single instant. He had walked in on the raw truth of their conflict. No performance, no carelessity. Mara noticed Ace paled. Not planned for any witness. Everything was slipping out of her and she could contain it. Lila stood off the table. Her pre-agreed window was not even finished. Crossed the line. Meeting is over. Turned and walked toward the exit. Mara sitting alone at the table exposed. Decided to let her pass. Their eyes met briefly. Lila did not stop to talk. She pushed through the glass doors and city sidewalk. Back inside, Mara sat alone. Ethan then approached her table. All his old doubts, the small uneasiness he had brushed aside for months, over him all at once. The mask was fully stripped away, and he could no longer pretend to see who Mara truly. The stakes were set. The private truce was impossible. Mara's threats against the designer were now out in the open, and Ethan temper firsthand. There was more space for quiet negotiation. The final showdown could no longer be avoided. The morning sun streamed through Viridian Creative Group's tall glass windows, but the atmosphere inside the open-plan office carried none of the usual weekday energy. The internal HR investigation had moved out of strict confidentiality. Word had begun to circulate in quiet whispers among staff. People traded quiet glances over cubicle dividers, unsure exactly what had happened, yet aware that something serious was unfolding. Mara arrived at work with hollow, red-rimmed eyes. After the disastrous cafe confrontation the night before, sleep had eluded her. She knew Ethan had seen her real, unmasked anger. She could no longer count on manipulating him to take her side. Every safety net she had woven over months was fraying away. Her mind fixated on retaliation against the junior designer whom she suspected of leaking the chat log. She drafted a harsh performance write-up in her work computer, ready to manufacture grounds to push the young woman out of the company. Before she could finalize that document, Ethan showed up at Clara's office door. He had spent the whole night turning over what he had witnessed inside the cafe. He could no longer bury his doubts or pretend Mara was the misunderstood victim she pretended to be. He knocked and stepped in, closing the glass door firmly behind. Without embellishment or emotional outburst, he recounted every detail of what he had seen and Mara's bribe offer to her open threat to hunt down and punish the anonymous junior team. Clara sat behind her desk, listening, and Ethan's eyewitness testimony added tangible weight to the existing redacted chat log evidence. Up until then, HR only held proof of stolen creative requests. Now they had confirmation Mara was willing to retaliate against innocent to protect. Shortly after Ethan finished giving his, HR summoned Mara into the main conference room for formal investigative. 2 HR representatives sat alongside. A tablet sat on, recording the whole. The conference room felt cold and Mara took the seat on. Her hands clamped tight together. She clung to familiar. She tried to paint the cafe meeting as nothing more than a harmless casual conversation. She insisted Ethan had misinterpreted, that she had never intended any real threat toward her. But when Ethan was brought in to give his live witness account directly to her composure fractured. She grew pensive, raised, and slipped into frustrations that only reinforced how volatile she could become. Down among those, the junior designer grew increasingly nervous. She noticed Mara repeatedly staring in her direction. Fear prickled at the neck. She messaged Lila, saying she believed Mara was about to fabricate bad performance notes fired. Lila received the text while sitting in her tent, and knew the moment. She contacted the HR ethics hots more. She submitted screenshots of Mara's blackmailed messages and relayed Ethan's willingness to. She made one final. take steps to shield the junior designer from manufactured discipline. Back inside the conference room, the HR panel laid out the full body of evidence piece. The time-stamped chat log excerpts, Lila's saved threatening SMS records, and Ethan's first-hand witness account all stacked against Mara. There was nowhere left for her to run. Every lie she had told dating back to Lila's sudden resignation collapsed her. Exhausted, Mara finally sagged. The practiced, charming persona she had worn for years fell away. She admitted she had repeatedly leaned on Lila. She confessed she had hoped to claim credit for the flagship redesign project to secure the senior creed promotion. She did not offer remorse, only bitter acknowledgement that her... Later same afternoon, HR delivered findings. Mara would be terminated immediately for creative appropriation, place coercion, and retaliation threats against her employees. Her severance would be minimal. Viridian would issue no positive professional reference for any job searches. Word of the termination spread through the office. Workers sat stunned, processing the reality that the rising star they had admired had built her career on stolen work. Clara pulled the nervous junior designer. Management her work record and confirmed there would be no retaliation against her. They recognized her quiet courage in coming forward with information. Relieved young woman. Ethan left the Viridian building. He texted Lila asking time. Wanted to apologize, to explain how thorough led him. Lila read the message, understood his regret, but she also knew their old relation paired. Too much betrayal and two lies stood between them. Gentle reply. Accepted his apology, but made it clear she was not interested in romance. Alone. Mara collected her personal belongings from her desk under the walkie staff and stopped to say goodbye. She carried a small card box through the office, past the cubicles where she had built a fraudulent reputation. Every eyes felt like a judgment. When she stepped out through the doors into bright daylight, it was over. But the consequences stretched further than just one lost job. The local creative industry network learned what had taken place. Her professional reputation had sustained last. Lila sat at home and stared out her apartment over the city. Immediate crisis was resolved. Mara had been held accountable, yet hollow, not triumphant. It had given her a second chance, but it had not erased all the pain of every lived through in her life. She had won, but the fight her time, peace of mind, and she used to be. No perfect, joyful revenge, only the weight of closing a terrible chapter. Autumn rain tapped softly against Lila's apartment window 2 weeks after Mara's termination at Viridian Creative Group. The sharp, urgent tension that had dominated her days for months had faded, yet quiet aftershocks lingered. News of Mara's firing had rippled through the local creative industry circles. Several agencies had reached out to Viridian to inquire about Mara's background, and Clara had stuck strictly to HR policy, giving only neutral dates of employment and no glowing endorsement. Without positive references, Mara struggled to land comparable creative work. Rumors circulated that she had taken a low-paying administrative position far outside the design field, forced to abandon the senior-level career she had stolen so ruthlessly to chase. Lila still received occasional, bitter social media messages from Mara, short, resentful notes blaming Lila for destroying her future, refusing to accept that her own choices and deceptions had caused the collapse. Lila never replied. She muted the account, choosing not to feed that cycle of anger. She understood Mara would carry that bitterness for a long time, and there was nothing she could say to change. Revenge would never bring closure, only building something new. Over at Viridian, the dust was slowly settling. The junior designer who had supplied the critical chat evidence kept her. Months of quiet courage had been recognized. Clara assigned her to lead a smaller internal branding project, giving her meaningful room to. Clara also sat down with her team and openly acknowledged her own blinds. She admitted she had been charmed by polished performance instead of evaluating real creative capability. It was not a grand public, just a quiet, honest conversation with her. A small step toward better workplace accounting. The $1 million client contract was. The company searched for external freelance creatives to rebuild the flagship brand redesign project from, and they reached out to Lila with a formal contract. When the freelance offer landed in Lila's email, she sat with it for a full hour. Viridian wanted her back and rescue the exact project that had sparked all the betrayal pain. The pay rate was generous, and it would be a substantial boost for her growing freelance part of her. It would be proof of skill, tangible validation after everything she heard. But she also knew returning to work for Viridian would mean stepping back into the orbit of. She did not hate company, but she no longer wanted to pour her energy into an environment that had once rewarded deception and nearly betrayed her. After careful thought, she wrote a polite profession. She wished them success, but Ethan crossed paths with Lila one Saturday afternoon at a downtown. Gray clouded sky overhead, and vendors called out over the hum. He spotted her browsing hands. He hesitated over. There was no urgent plea for reconciliation this time. No apology. He simply wanted plainly. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, his calm. "I said I was. Not just to Mara, but to how much you went through. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you..." At his gaze. Some of the old hurts inside her, but the sharpened. "I am saying that. I hope well." Reconnection. No romance. They exchanged one quiet nod, then went their separate ways. The chapter of their relationship closed, right? But because they had grown into people who... Lila poured her focus into her independence. She took on smaller, thoughtful clients who valued her original start. Some weeks brought tightness and stress, the ordinary hardships of running one creative business. But for the first time in lifetimes, the idea, every win, entirely to her. No one stood waiting in her work. No charming manipulator waited to take credit for months. Last evening, Lila spread her latest set of finished design sketches across Rain's window glass. She told timeline, the burned-out, regret-filled version of herself who had lost aid. She thought of the day she walked out of Viridius without warning, choosing to quit rather than work. Rebirth, a second chance, but suffering. She had carried fear, grief, and anger every step of the fight. She had been forced to weigh hard choices, painful costs. Perfectly healed. She still had scars, but she was free. She did not get some victory parade. There was no satisfying final showdown where Mara broke down in remorse. Some would be fully fixed. She had broken the cycle. She would sacrifice herself. Lila gathered her sketches, stacked them neatly on her laptop. Outside a soft drizzle, she pulled on her coat, grabbed her keys, and headed out for a long streets. They stretched out her, uncertain, entirely her own.